Today, in episode number 78, I want to talk with you about living the full life that God has promised us, even if we're in the midst of a very limiting season. So, listen in. Welcome to the UnPerfect podcast. I'm your host, Shelly Snead, and I help Christian women see glimpses of glory in the now and the not yet of their unperfect lives. If you struggle with fully living the life you've been dealt, congrats, you're officially human, and you're not alone. Hope and probably some humor are coming up. Hello, friends. I have got to tell you this hilarious story about my oldest son. He is one of the most driven people I know, and this is a trait he clearly got from his father. But one morning when he was in high school, we were talking about his 4 high school classes he had that semester, 2 of which were symphonic band and AP music theory. And I just remember him sighing and saying, only half the semester is going to suck. And I was like, oh, well, which half is that? And his reply, y'all, was so classic Silas, because he goes, well, it's the half that's not in the band room. That was classic Silas because he loved everything music and pretty much nothing else. But it was a profound statement because that's kind of the rub with life, isn't it? Like passionately living out the parts of life that don't suck or feel significant, but then figuring out how to tolerate the rest. But I've often had this thought, what if John 10:10 wasn't meant to be based on our circumstances? Like, what if we had been given the ability and means to live with such purpose that even the parts of life that we have to live within boundaries or limits still offered us opportunities to experience the wonder of life to the full or abundant life that Jesus promises there? I love some parts of my life. I mean, love them. But there are some aspects of some parts, some seasons I've been stuck in against my will that frankly suck, to quote my son. And in episode number 72, we talked about how we can live more contentedly when we're in a place of discontentment. But today we're going to go a little deeper into just this whole notion that we are in seasons of limitations, and many of which are completely out of our control. And many of you are in a season like this. Here's how I know. I conducted a survey for you guys, my listeners, for my readers that get my newsletter every week this past August. And I asked a lot of fun, like demographic type questions because I want to be able to meet the needs of you, my listener, by providing insight and wisdom that you can relate to. And I learned a lot of fun things about you, your age ranges, if you have kids, if your pets are your kiddos, if you're married or single. I learned what topics resonate the most with you, which is kind of what led to this season's theme, which is doing hard with hope. Because a whopping 67% of you said you wanted to learn about trusting God through difficult seasons. And then I got up in your business in my survey, and one of the questions I asked was this: what is your biggest spiritual challenge right now? Like, it could be from fears to frustrations. And I got a lot of different answers, and I prayed over each answer as they came in. But here were some of the types of seasons that you guys said you were in: insecurity, belonging, feeling unworthy, unbelief. I see you, like the dad in the Gospels who said, I trust you, Jesus, but help my unbelief. Parenting adult children. I see you there too, because I'm in the thick of that with you. Anxiety and fear, single parenting, consistency in spiritual growth and truly relying on God, prayer life, physical sickness and disease, issues with finances and provisions, both spiritual, financial, emotional, and relational, like provision, trusting in God. And can I just say that's a lot? Like any one of those seasons is a lot to manage. And some of you are managing multiple limitations at the same time. So today, I just wanted to share with you a little process, a series of a few questions, really, that might give you some insight and some hope if you're in one of these seasons of struggle. So here's the first question I want you to ask yourself. What are my limitations in this season? Let's just recognize that we live limited. We all have a boundary that we wish wasn't there. And we're in good company because Jesus did that, right? Philippians 2. He left glory. He left a throne and came down to put on skin, living a limited life, even though the fullness of God was with him. But just whatever's giving you that angst, that source. We talked about this a little bit in episode number 72. But in 72, we talked about, what about this season or what about your life is making you discontent? This I'm talking about just what are those limitations that you have right now in your season? So, for instance, I might have said, back to answer that question of naming it in number 72, I'm discontent because I can't be as productive. I'm not getting a lot done because of kids in the home that need more of me. Well, what I'm talking about here would be to zero in on what exactly is that limitation. That limitation, that season that I'm in, is that I have children in the home because of trauma in their past that need a lot more of my time and attention than typical teenagers would. And that's not good or bad. It's just where I am. I want to name it and be specific about what do I feel is limiting me or some boundaries that I wish weren't there. Okay, so number 1 is name it. What are my limitations in this season? Number 2 is this. Have I grieved my losses properly? We just got to acknowledge I'd rather be somewhere else. I'd rather be in a different season. Things didn't go as planned. I was dreaming that at this stage in my life, I was going to be doing A, and I'm actually doing B because life has limited me to that. I love the author, Kate Bowler, and she says in her book, The Lives We Actually Have, which is a book of blessings, but this one I love. It says, "Blessed are you when mourning is the holy work of the moment, for it speaks of what is real." I think there's a lot of power in taking a moment, however long that moment needs to be, to grieve what we feel like we've lost. And I did a whole podcast episode about this. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail, but in that episode, number 7, I'll link to it in the show notes, there were some practical things that we can do to actively engage in that grieving process. So if this is something that stands out to you and you're like, ooh, I need to do that, check that episode out. So have I grieved my losses properly? Number 3 is, what wisdom is God giving me? We know that he gives wisdom to all who ask in faith. We know that from James. But what I'm talking about here is we have to be in his word and in prayer. Like, this is not a season to be satisfied with yesterday's crumbs. We need to be feasting at the table of his word. We need to do that all the time. But in seasons where we are living limited, if you're like me, sometimes we're spending a little more time trying to figure out how to get out of it or how to push those boundaries a little bit than we are just sitting at his feet. Just this morning in my quiet time, I read this quote by Henry Nouwen that I'm going to share with you because it was so powerful. He said, "I have to kneel before the Father, put my ear against his chest, and listen without interruption to the heartbeat of God." That's powerful. To be that in tune with God. And that takes time and quiet and intention. And I'm going to share this too. I try to fast one day a week. And I know we're not supposed to talk about fasting because he says, go in your closet, don't tell anybody you're doing it, whatever. But the reason I'm sharing this because I was just talking with a friend about it this weekend who seemed fascinated with this idea. But I do think in our Western culture, we fast at very random times, but it's not just one of our spiritual disciplines like reading our Bible or practicing the Sabbath or praying. And I think for the early church and the followers of Jesus, especially after his death, this was just a given. This is what they did. And all I do is from dinner the night before to dinner the next day, I try to pick one day a week, and it ends up being a different day each week because I kind of work it. When's going to be a day that I can do it without, like, I have a lunch date or a coffee date with someone. I don't want to put them in a weird position. And I also try to do it when I have a little more free time so that I can stop throughout the day and spend more time in prayer and focused on the Lord. But the reason I'm mentioning that here is because I think fasting actually makes us hungrier for feasting at the table of God's word. There's something about going without, being a little uncomfortable, and there's a lot of other wonderful things about fasting. I will also link to a John Mark Comer Practicing the Way 4-week podcast series on this that I think you'll learn a lot if this is something that sticks out to you. But whether that's part of your rhythm or not, really being intentional about slowing down enough to stop, to listen, to inundate ourselves in the scriptures, to have literally our ear right up next to the chest of God, hearing his heartbeat. And that's where we're going to get the wisdom that we need for these limited seasons. Okay, so that's number 3. What wisdom is God giving me? And number 4, what gift am I overlooking within my season-ordained boundaries? Okay, and again, I mentioned this last week. I'm not talking about let's just find the good in everything and be happy. I'm talking God has given me something to work with. And I know this because of the parable of the talents. Like, I may not be in a 5-talent season. I may not be in a 2-talent season. It may just be one little talent. But if I'm burying it, then I'm not doing what he's called me to do. And I know if he calls me to love him and to love others, the whole law is summed up in those 2 commands, right? Then he's got to have given me the means to do it within whatever season I'm in. So maybe I need to stop comparing myself to what everybody else is doing and focus on what is it that he wants me to do. Whether it's a spiritual gift he's given you, whether it's investing your talents, the experiences that you have, even in this season of limits, or maybe it's just because your season is so limited right now, your life is so limited, that here's an opportunity to live quietly, accomplishing little more than just being attuned to the heart of the Savior. Ear next to his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and slowly learning that is enough. So I don't know what it is that could be the gift or the talent that God is wanting you to invest during this season. But I just pray that you would take a moment to think through that and pray through that. And if that last thought really resonated with you, Sarah Haggerty has written a beautiful book entitled The Gift of Limitations. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that. I've read it, and it's just a beautiful book with a lot of her story in it. I hope you'll take time to think through these 4 questions. As always, I'm not expecting you to have them memorized. I've got them listed in a free printable download for you, so you can check the link in the show notes for that. But I am praying that you'll put some weight to naming your current God-ordained boundaries or limits, that you'll take some time to grieve what you had hoped or dreamed for in this season, that you will seek God for wisdom that he wants to give you in this season, and that you'll curiously look for maybe an overlooked gift that these limits have blessed you with. If you have loved this episode, please give a quick rating and review. It only takes a second, I promise. And that's one of the easiest ways others will find this podcast. You could also share it with a friend who could use this exact encouragement today. As always, I'm praying that you're able to see glimpses of God's glory in the now and the not yet of your unperfect life this week. I'll see you next time.